So, if you're just joining by video now, and you are if you're watching this video, we're talking about the popular expectation for the Messiah and what Jesus actually was. Now, one thing that there's some overlap here. There are some overlaps here, prophet. But here in verse 31, they say, well, the Messiah, when the Messiah comes, will he do more signs than this man does? Because this man does some pretty nifty signs. And so there's an idea that he will come and no one will know his origin, but he will perform miraculous signs. And we're going to see that at the opening of our reading today in Matthew 16. Now, this is the popular expectation. This is what Messiah is supposed to be like. Nobody knows where he comes from. He comes and proves he's Messiah with all sorts of miraculous signs. He raises a great army. He defeats the Romans. He brings everybody to a better place spiritually. You kill all the sinners too, okay? You get rid of those people. And then, it's a great day to be Jewish because Messiah is on the throne. Okay, so that's what's going to happen. Now, what did Jesus say? How did he compare to the popular expectation? What about this one right
to
here?
begin with, he was sort of an average person.
Okay, so first of all, he said, Jim says an average person.
Average looking person.
Average looking person. Isaiah says there's nothing to attract us, you know. So he's average. He's average looking. He is, in fact, a carpenter's son, and other translation or other gospel says he's the carpenter. He's a peasant. He works with his hands. So he's not, just doesn't quite do this right here. But what does he like to talk about in the book of Matthew in particular? He goes around talking about what?
Kingdom of heaven.
The kingdom, yeah. He keeps talking about this kingdom, but funny thing, this kingdom doesn't seem to have much of a, it says the poor in spirit. The people who are persecuted. You know, it's not very triumphal. There's not much of this going on. And then, the idea that this is going to be a powerful and mighty ruler, we're going to run head on into that here. Because what we're going to go with this thing increasingly is that this is going to be a suffering Messiah. A suffering Messiah. Now, understand that you and I, when we think about Jesus Christ, we think about a cross. We drive by a building, there's a cross there, say, that's a church building, you know. We see somebody wearing a cross, we say, well, that person either likes a cross or they're a Christian, or they're trying to say something about Christianity, they're wearing a cross. Back then, the idea of a Messiah on the cross was just revolting. How could a Messiah, God's chosen, anointed one, end up on a cross? This shouldn't happen. It's just crazy. Okay? So we're going to work some on this idea about who was Jesus and what was his true identity. So let's do this. I'm going to jump over the review questions. You can do those for homework. And we're going to go right to Matthew 16, verse 1. And I want to read verses 1 through 4. So I'm going to ask Jason to cut through the muffle of his mask and read loud and clear verses 1 through 4. Okay?
And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, when it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed.
Okay, so it says here that the Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus. We don't usually run into Sadducees outside of Jerusalem, okay? But here they are. They're the Pharisees, and for a fact here, those of you who know about red and blue in our country, about Republicans and Democrats, I'm going to put them in. So what do we know about Sadducees? This is the only second time they've been mentioned in the book of Matthew. What are some things we know about Sadducees? Help me with your first name again. Melissa?
Oh, with an A.
Alyssa Finley. Okay, Alyssa, what do you know about Sadducees?
They're sad.
Because?
That's good.
Because they're too concerned with the law.
Well, here's the deal. Sadducees only believed in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, and therefore they didn't believe in angels, and they did not believe in resurrection. Since they didn't believe in resurrection, they were sad, you see, because they didn't believe in any life after death. So that's how we remember that. They were sad, you see. So the thing we want to know about these guys, though, is that they are close to Herod. In fact, sometimes we run into this expression, Herodians, and some people think those are really the two of the same things. They're in bed with power, okay? And usually they don't get along with Pharisees, whose name means separate. Pharisees wanted to say separate from all that worldly stuff. But here they're getting together. Why are they hanging out together, you think? What are they doing hanging out together?
You know, when siblings fight and a third person comes in.
Yeah. So they're both going after Jesus, so they get together and go after Jesus. It says here that they came to test him. Test him. In other words, to discredit him. Okay, let's just get that straight. It's not like, oh goody, if he passes the test, we'll all bow down to him. No. These guys are trying to discredit Jesus. And so they want a sign from heaven. Now let's get the context here going real good. So what's just been happening in the book of Matthew? Jesus has been going around Galilee, and what sort of things has he been doing?
Miracles.
What'd you say?
Miracles.
Miracles. What kind of miracles? Name a few.
Feeding 4,000. Healing people.
Feeding a great multitude. Healing people. Calming storms. Stuff like that, you know. But these guys, they want a sign from heaven. What do you think they had in mind when they said a sign from heaven? What would that be? I think you can get a little bit of the idea if you look at Jesus' response here. He's talking about weather forecasting, you know. But I think when they say a sign from heaven, they're saying, well, if you really are the Messiah, could you make the sun stand still? Could you make the moon turn blood red? Could you, make it turn dark? And so forth and so on. Remember, this is not an altogether crazy idea, because in chapter, I think, 2 of Matthew, we run into some people called wise men. We call them wise men. The actual word that's used is, I'm having a 60s moment here, I can't remember exactly. But anyway, they said, we are coming to find the King of the Jews because what? What had they seen? They won't.
They've seen a sign in heaven.
Yes.
They've seen a star above, a light.
They said, we saw a star when it rose. So there's this idea that if you're Messiah, you should be able to get the sun, the moon, the stars, the weather. You'll be able to do something here and make it happen. And if you can't, then you obviously are not Messiah. So Jesus responds by saying, well, you guys can tell the weather by looking at the heavens, but you can't interpret what? He indicts them because he said, you're not paying attention to what?
Times. The times.
The signs of the times. So this means they need to watch more CNN, more Fox News, read editorials. No. I think what he's saying is, he says you don't see the spiritual decay in your society ultimately leading to the eradication, essentially, of their nation in 70 AD, about 40 years from now.
He may be critiquing their understanding of the prophecies in the Old Testament, which really is a critique, because that's their expertise. And I think he's saying you aren't paying attention to what you're supposed to know.
Yeah, there's an alignment between what they're doing and their reception of Jesus and the Old Testament prophets. And maybe they should have realized that. He calls them here in verse 4 a wicked and adulterous generation. He says, you're wicked and adulterous. Now, this word right here, we don't use this much because we talk about people having affairs and not committing adultery. It may mean that they were sexually immoral, there's plenty of that going on, but it's also used frequently in the Old Testament to talk about people whose hearts are, they include a little idol worship, a little worldliness on the side. It's blending your commitment to God with your commitment to other things. Just like you would say to your mate, well, I won't be around this weekend. I've got, a business out of town, and you have more than one love interest. And so, same way in your relationship with God, he calls them an evil and adulterous generation. This is strongly paralleled, a very similar situation in chapter 12, verses 38 through 40 that you read there. And so some people would say, well, this is just two accounts of the same thing. I don't know why that would be, why you couldn't have something similar happen twice. In my life, it seems like we see a lot of things happen over and over again. So anyway, I believe maybe it's the same thing, not the same thing happening again, but something similar. And we get a longer version in chapter 12. Jesus explains what he means when he says, no sign will be given except the sign of the prophet Jonah. So what does Jesus mean, and why on earth would he use Jonah as an example? What do you think, Nate? Why does he use Jonah as an example?
I think Jesus is trying to apply. He will be the savior for people. He will die for us, and after 3 days he will.
Okay, he'll die for our sins. So Jonah's on the ship. He's running away from God. That's not a very Jesus-like thing to be doing. But he's running from God. They run into a big storm. He tells everybody, throw me over. That's the only way you're going to survive. They don't want to do it. They're pagans. But they say, okay, that's what we're going to do. So they throw him overboard. And Jonah what? What happens to him next? This is where Jesus says it's like him. What happens next? He's swallowed by a great fish, 3 days and 3 nights inside the fish, then he comes out. But what happens next? Well, he goes to Nineveh and preaches to the people. He doesn't want to. He goes there, preaches to the people, they repent. So he is a prophet against a corrupt society. But the main thing that Jesus is pointing out here is the parallel between his time in the grave and Jonah's time in the fish. There are some other parallels. We won't try to chase those down here, but interesting that Jonah, who is kind of a rebellious character, at the end of his book, Jonah and God are still having a fight. It's kind of a strange character that Jesus kind of references here. At any rate, that's what he says when they ask him for the sign.
So, actually, he was giving them a sign. He said, will be given. And he's expecting those who would be perceptive to realize after he rises again to see it. And the very fact that he announced it beforehand on this occasion could not be natural. It had to be from heaven that he forecasted.
Very good point. And maybe...
And also, let me say that John tells us that many in the Sanhedrin believed.
Exactly. And there's a very famous Pharisee that believed, and he is who?
Nicodemus.
Well, Nicodemus probably became a disciple based on John, but I'm thinking about somebody even more famous than Nicodemus. A Pharisee of Pharisees.
Oh, Paul.
Yeah, Saul of Tarsus, who now we call Paul. So yeah, maybe they did get the sign, some of them anyway, eventually. Okay, so here's the next section is what I think of as being humorous. There are places in the Bible that are really pretty funny if you just read them that way. Thomas, could you read verses 5 through 12 for us, please? Chapter 16, verses 5 through 12.
When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Be careful, Jesus said to them, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They discussed this among themselves and said, it was because we didn't bring any bread. However, the discussion, Jesus asked, you of little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Do you remember the 5 loaves for 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you didn't understand that I was not talking about your bread, but on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees.
How many people here have read the book or seen the movie The Blind Side? Okay, a few of us have seen that or heard it. You know, the story is the story of this very athletic, gigantic African-American boy, Michael Oher. And Michael is homeless, and he's adopted by a very, very wealthy white couple in Memphis, the Tuohys, Sean and Leanne Tuohy. And Michael, all of his life, has faced hunger, just getting enough food. And they give him his own room in their nice home up there in Memphis, and they find that he keeps getting food and hiding it in his room. Well, this is funny because the Tuohys, the way they got to be rich is they own a lot of Taco Bell, Mexican restaurant. They own a lot of them, okay? And they tell Michael, look, if you want something at any of our Taco Bells, just go there and tell them what you want and tell them you're our son and you don't have to pay for it. Just go get it, okay? But he keeps bringing this food home and hiding it like in his dresser drawer. And they're telling him, Michael, we know you're a big guy and we know you eat a lot of food. You're hungry. But we own the restaurant. You don't have to hide it in your room. There's always going to be plenty of food for you. If you don't have it downstairs in the refrigerator, get in your car, go over to the Taco Bell and tell them whatever you want, they'll give it to you, okay? So he has to unlearn this habit of hiding and saving up food. So what's funny here? They're rolling across and somebody says, hey, I'm getting hungry, about time for lunch, isn't it? I thought you were supposed to, I didn't get it. Did you get, no, I didn't get anything. And so there's this big discussion, and Jesus, in the middle of the discussion, he says, beware of the yeast of the Sadducees and Pharisees. Now, we've run into yeast before in one of the kingdom parables, I think in chapter 13. Jesus said, a little yeast leavens a whole lump of dough. Now, in that parable, some people disagree, but I think the yeast is something good. Almost everywhere else yeast is mentioned in the New Testament, it's a symbol for something corrupting and bad. And that's the case here. So it's clear that when Jesus says, hey guys, we own the store, okay? I'm not going to let you starve. I can make food, all the food, I can feed thousands of people. Remember? It hadn't been long. Remember? So don't worry about not bringing bread with you, okay? We'll cover you there. Instead, we're talking about the influence. I think here maybe even uses the word what? Instead of influence, he says what? Beware of the what? Of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Instead of influence, he says what? Help me out here. Teaching. Doctrine. Teaching. Okay, so now, if you're sitting at home, you're probably not pondering the yeast, the influence, the teaching of Pharisees and Sadducees. You're probably not very tempted to go in that direction. It's 2,000 years later, okay? But the thing about this yeast is it's very quiet. It's very insidious, and it spreads quietly. And before you know it, it's spread throughout. It's a Michaelis-Menten reaction or something like that, if you remember that from school. It's got this logarithmic exponential growth curve. So what sort of yeast would Jesus warn you and me about today? What would be the yeast that he would warn us about? What are some things that you would identify as being kind of kind of yeasty in our culture today. Anybody have an idea? Jason, what do you think?
Well, false teachers come to mind immediately.
You know my answer.
I said false teachers.
Well, false teachers is kind of an open-ended thing. You know, am I a false teacher? Who is a false teacher? But false teaching would be, I'm gonna just use this word, bad doctrine, bad ideas about God. You know. So yeah, that's true. But anything a little more specific. Here's one that I see a lot of, and that's this almost God for Americans. And this is the idea of personal autonomy. That my right to make a choice is the number one thing. And so this is what the idea of abortion is all tied to here, is that the individual's choice outweighs the interests of society or morality or anything else. Morality is basically what I say it is for me. And so I'm in personal autonomy is really big. Anything else that you could think of? This is one that you may or may not be into. We used to call it postmodernism, and now it has become applied postmodernism, which is also known as critical theory. And there's some good points to postmodernism critical theory, but at its heart, it rejects the idea of objective truth. It says truth is a social construct, okay? And so, like, you know, at the end of the book of John, when Pilate, Jesus on trial there, says, what's truth? Don't come at me about truth. You know, I don't believe truth, objective truth. So that's something that really infects so much of our thinking today, that it's just what your community thinks, you know? It's not really, we wouldn't know objective truth if we had it, you know? Now, if I go to the doctor and he tells me I have cancer, I'm not going this way, or my accountant about how much tax I owe. It's not a social construct. There is one real answer out there. So, you know, we tend to operate on different planes. Certainly, this is one that infiltrates all of our thinking. It's very yeasty, sexual immorality, materialism. You know, these are old things, nothing new, or and then just doubt is always, you know, plaguing us. Agnosticism. We really don't know what the truth is. So these are some things I think Jesus would caution us about. Tied in with this in a really complicated way is what we call identity politics, or maybe tribalism. And it means that we are unable to listen to people that disagree with us. Okay, so Jesus then, verse 13, came to the region of Caesarea Philippi. So I think I've told you already that we're in a cycle here, chapters 14, 15, 16, 17, where Jesus withdraws. So we saw him going over there to the region of Tyre and Sidon, where he ran into the fantastic woman that he said had great faith over there, the Canaanite woman. And now, this is really, I used to get this confused all the time. For 100 extra points in the course here, who can tell us where Caesarea Philippi is? It says he didn't go into town, but he came to the region or the district of Caesarea Philippi. Raise your hand if you're willing to play. Who knows? Where is it? Jim, do you know?
Well, there are two Caesareas in the Bible. Weren't there?
Yes, good. Good
this
for
is
you.
The one up north on the coast, I think.
Well, the one on the coast is the one that we run into so often in the book of Acts. It's where Paul was in prison for 2 years. It's on the coast. It's a military stronghold. Sometimes it's called Caesarea Maritima or something, but we just use Caesarea usually. okay? And they've done a lot of archaeological excavation in Caesarea and found all sorts of neat stuff there. But this is not that Caesarea, okay? You know, if you look at a map of Palestine, Jordan, whatever, you got the Sea of Galilee up here, and then down here we've got what's left of the Dead Sea, okay? This place is way up north, as Jim pointed out. It's up here. There's one of the sources of the Jordan River up north of the Sea of Galilee is a place where there's a bunch of springs together. And what's interesting about this place is a long time before, the Greeks had said, oh, this place is sacred to the Greek god Pan. Then Herod the Great, said, well, be a good place here, nice place up north in the mountains. We'll build a temple to Caesar Augustus. All right, now we're getting someplace. Then his son, when Herod the Great died, there were 3 sons that survived. He killed some of his sons, but there was Philip, there was Antipas, and there was Archelaus. Well, Philip went up here and built a city. And guess what he named the city? Caesarea, after Caesar, your boss. And then guess what the second name of the city was? Well, after himself, Caesarea Philippi, okay? So that's where we are, way up north in pagan country. Kind of like where you and I are, because there's some Jews up there too. There's some people who worship God too, but it's also a place that is kind of steeped in paganism. And this is where Jesus goes to have the key conversation in the book of Matthew, okay? If we look at the whole book of Matthew, one way that we could outline it is like this. And, the first part is Jesus proclaims the kingdom of heaven. And then the second part is Jesus suffers for our sins. So these are the 2 big parts of his mission. And this point right here is chapter 16, 21 through 28. That's where we're headed, okay? So that's what this is all about. This is the turning point of the whole book. When he came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? And they replied, some say John the Baptist, and some say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So all these people that they name have a couple of things in common. And what things do they have in common, Jason? Well, first, it's really simple.
Say the names again.
Well, the one I was thinking of is they're all dead. Okay, they're all dead. What did they do when they were alive, though? Maybe you already said this, Jason. I didn't hear real well. Okay, what did they do when they were alive? What was their job? What did they do? Alyssa, what did they do?
I'm sorry, I'm a little lost. Who are we talking about exactly?
Okay, we're talking about the people that people identified Jesus as being. He said, who do people say I am? They say, well, this is verse 14. Some say John the Baptist. Others say Elijah. Still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So all these people Jesus is identified with, what did they do when they were alive? They were prophets, okay, and great prophets. Not a lot of miracles going on, except maybe Elijah, but mostly prophets, okay? All right, so they're, or one of the prophets, So everybody says, they think there's one of the prophets who's come back to life. That's popular. In other words, we hear it today, he was a great teacher, great moral teacher, okay? But what about you, he asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now, this is why we did the exercise to begin with, okay? Because Peter says, first, he says, basically, Jesus has 2 jobs, okay? It's kind of like this thing right here. He says, you're the Messiah, check, and you are the Son of the living God. Now, there are places in Matthew that have told us that Jesus is the son of David, which would identify him as being Messiah. There are places that have said a little bit about him being the Messiah. Son of man is what we read a lot of. Son of God, just a couple of places. One of the places I pointed out earlier was back here in chapter 14. Remember when the disciples are terrified and they're out there on the lake about to drown. Jesus calms the storm. You know, Peter does the walking on the water. At the end of chapter 14, verse 33, those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "You are the what? You are the Son of God." But notice here, we're combining two roles. We're combining Messiah with the Son of the living God. Let me ask you one of the hard questions that I ask sometime that requires you to read my mind a little bit. Why does Peter, think about the context of where they are here, why does he add this adjective? Living God. What do you think that's all about? Remember this, in this culture, to claim to be the son of a divinity was not that uncommon. Nowadays, when people do that, we think they need mental health services, okay? But a lot of great leaders back then, their PR people would go around telling people that, you know, they were actually... And so here you are, and you've got Caesar, a temple to Caesar Augustus, area sacred to the Greek god Pan, and Peter says, you're not just the son of any god, you're the son of the living God, okay? So to put these two things together is pretty radical at this point in the gospel, both Messiah and divinity, the Son of the living God. Okay. So Jesus said, here we are back in chapter 16, verse 17. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon and son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he ordered the disciples not to tell anyone he was the Messiah. Newsflash, Jesus gives them other instructions at the end of Matthew chapter 28. It's called the Great Commission. A lot of us, the way we live our lives is we think we're still under that, command not to tell anybody. But you don't have to go around not telling anybody. Now you can tell people, okay? Just making a joke. All right. So, this passage that we just read, that I just read, presents us with all sorts of difficulties. And I spent a good bit of my time this week kind of wrestling with this a little bit. So maybe you can wrestle with it some too now. He said, "Right answer, Peter. Good for you. In fact, you're so dumb, Peter, I don't think you figured this out on your own. And I don't think any of you other guys told him. I think he got it from God." Okay, that's great. But then he says, "Upon this rock I will build my church." He said, "You are Petros, and upon this Petra I will build my church." This is the first time in the gospel that we've read this word ekklesia in Greek. It means we translate it church. And I think it only appears like 3 times in the gospels. Big thing in the book of Acts. But the idea that Jesus is here to build a community, he's been talking about the kingdom of heaven a lot, okay? But now he talks about his church, his ecclesia, his assembly, his called out ones. Okay, so we got that much, but what is the rock? He says, this rock. What is this rock? This Petra, upon which you will build the church. What are some ideas that you've heard?
I believe this is hope.
Yes, that Peter had some sort of primacy, primary role, foremost role among the apostles, and therefore he would be the foundation of the church, and he was given the keys of the kingdom. Okay. So that's a possible explanation. The reason I quoted the Greek words, the Greek word that's translated Peter is the masculine form, Petros, which means a rock that you or I could pick up and throw, okay? A stone, a pebble. And the Petra is the feminine form, and we run into this in the Sermon on the Mount. The wise man built his house upon a what? Upon the rock, okay? Now, you don't build your house on a rock that you can pick up and throw, okay? This Petra is like an outcropping or a massive bluff, some sort of a rock formation that would give you a house that could stand against the storm, okay? So it's a different size structure altogether. Nevertheless, these two words are definitely related. And I think to evaluate it, we'd have to look and see what role that Peter actually played in the rest of the New Testament. And although he's one of the stars of the book of Acts, he doesn't appear to exert authority over the others. In fact, in Galatians, we find where Paul says, I rebuked him to his face because he was acting like a racist. So, you know, we see that going on. Clearly, though, in this whole chapter and in the gospel at large, the identity of Jesus is very basic to the whole Christian faith. I think based on that context, I would lean on the idea that the rock that Jesus built his church on is his true identity. Okay, what do you think it means here? And the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, there's a footnote in the NIV that says Hades means the realm of the dead. In the Old Testament, it's called Sheol. What does it mean the gates of Hades will not overcome this church that's built on this rock? Some people say the word it there, the gates of Hades will not overcome it. It's talking about this key fact. And other people say, no. It is the church, okay? Let's put that on hold for a second and just talk about what this means. The gates of Hades will not overcome it. What does that mean? What do you think?
I think that God's intent for the church in this world, the body of Christ, is going to succeed and not be snuffed out. That reminds me of the language in John 1. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it. Interesting to me is that he doesn't say the light will overcome the darkness. He says the darkness will not overcome the light. And that's the kind of statement we have here.
Okay, so I think...
God's not going to have 100% victory in the world, but his work is not going to be snuffed out.
Okay, so the thing for us to read here, when we read the gates of Hades, this whole expression is death. And as Jim has pointed out, it's very clear in John 1:1, antithetical to light and life. Okay? Now, the gates of, people have worried about this, say, well, gates are primarily defensive. And is it that the church is going to bust out of hell or bust into hell, or what's the thing here? We know about access, don't we? If you had an ancient city, the gates was how you access the city. The gates were the power of the city, okay? Nowadays, it's your user ID and password, right? But back then, it was the gates of the city. You got the right user ID and password, you could be really powerful today. But back then, it was the gates. And if you've got the keys, if you've got the way to get through the gates, then you can control the city. And so what he's saying here is that my kingdom, my church is going to own death. It's going to own death. Death, where is your victory? Death, where is your sting? So that's what he's talking about here. And all these sins, all this spiritual pollution are the forces of death. And he said, death will not overcome my church. We've covered a lot of material today, and you all have stayed awake. You have participated pretty well through the Mass, and I just really want to commend you for this. Next week we'll move into the Transfiguration, but I want you to notice one thing, because I mentioned this being a turning point, and that's verse 21 here. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed and on the third day raised to life. This is the first of three key predictions. So we're going to be working through this in the next few chapters, where Jesus talks about the second part of his role, and that is his suffering. We'll work on that a little bit next week too, but I want to point that out. Okay, that's just great. Thank you so much for letting me keep you a little bit late today.